Sometimes in this job, I come across these stories and it's like, wow, is this real? It's like an alternate reality or something. Like today we're going deep on U.S.-Russia relations, and there's a chance things could really change.
Yeah, it really is pretty remarkable, especially given how things have been between these two countries historically.
Exactly. But recently, it really seems like things are shifting, and it seems like a lot of it is because President Trump wants to end this conflict in Ukraine quickly.
It's really interesting that Trump has been so active in this. Like, he's even spoken to Putin directly.
He has?
I mean, a phone call on February 12th and then meetings in Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We haven't really seen this type of direct engagement before.
And it's not just talk. Apparently, the White House is actually working on a plan for sanctions relief. They told the state and treasury departments to make a list of sanctions that could be eased, as part of negotiations with Russia. Some are even saying sanctions on certain oligarchs in Russia could be on the table.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal. It seems like they're serious about, exploring all their options to try to get what they want. But it is important to remember that the specifics of what the U.S. might offer and what they want in return are still secret.
It's like they're playing poker and nobody wants to show their cards right.
Yeah, exactly. It's very hush-hush right now, which I think just makes it even more interesting.
But one thing does seem pretty clear. Economic cooperation seems to be a big focus in these talks.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you think about the impact of these sanctions. The Kremlin even said recently that they might be open to deals on rare earth metals. So that could be a huge area where they could work together.
So easing these sanctions could be a big economic win-win.
Well, it's definitely possible. I mean, any big economic agreements would probably need at least some sanctions relief to happen.
And hold on, what about Congress? Don't they get a say in this?
Oh, yeah, you're totally right. Even if President Trump wants to ease these sanctions, he might have a tough time getting Congress on board. Some of these sanctions would need Congress to sign off to be lifted. And that's not always so easy.
Plus, we've got that state of emergency from way back in 2014 because of what happened in Crimea. That's still in effect. So that's another layer of complexity here. What does that actually mean in this situation?
Well, a state of emergency basically gives the president more power to deal with a crisis. So it basically says this is a really serious situation and we need to treat it that way. But it also makes it potentially tougher to just lift sanctions, both legally and politically.
So there are a lot of moving pieces here.
Yeah, for sure. And on top of all of that, we haven't even talked about something else that's going on. President Trump has been trying to get a minerals deal with Ukraine.
Wait, are we talking about that Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky?
That's the one.
It seems like forever ago, but that was a big deal at the time.
Oh, yeah. And even though no deal was actually signed, there's been a lot of talk about maybe there's a connection between Trump wanting these Ukrainian minerals and him being willing to lift sanctions on Russia.
Okay, now I'm really interested. What's the connection there?
Well, Ukraine has tons of lithium and rare earth minerals, and those are really valuable resources for the U.S. If Trump can get access to those resources from Ukraine, it could make the U.S. less dependent on other sources like Russia.
It's like a strategic move.
Exactly.
Right.
Getting access to Ukraine's minerals could give the U.S. more leverage when they're negotiating with Russia, and it could also make easing sanctions less risky for the U.S. economy down the road.
This is getting really interesting. But we've been focusing a lot on the U.S. side of all of this. What's Russia thinking about all of this?
Well, Putin himself has said publicly that Russia is open to working together to develop those rare earth metal deposits. They're clearly interested in working together on the economic side, especially if it means getting some relief from the sanctions.
So it sounds like both sides are at least open to talking. But what about the conflict in Ukraine? Where do things stand with that?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. President Trump seems to think that both Russia and the people there really want peace and to end this conflict. He even basically said that people who don't want peace aren't going to last long.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
Hmm.
But Zelensky, Ukraine's president, doesn't seem to agree with Trump. He recently said that peace is still a long way off.
True, they definitely seem to have different views on the situation. But it's interesting that Zelensky also said later that Kiev needs peace as soon as possible and that he hopes the U.S. will help them achieve that. So it's not totally clear what he thinks.
So there's a lot going on here. Potential for cooperation, but also totally opposite points of view. It's a lot to take in.
It definitely is. It seems like we're at a real turning point in U.S.-Russia relations. And the next few days and weeks are going to be really important in figuring out if things are actually going to change or not.
It's kind of like we're watching this high stakes, diplomatic dance playing out in real time.
Right. And you know what? I think it's easy to just get caught up in all the big implications, economics, the politics, all that. But we can't forget about the people whose lives are really affected by what happens.
Yeah, you're right. So what are people who are actually living in the middle of this conflict thinking? How are they feeling about this potential change in U.S. policy?
I think it's a mix of hope and skepticism. Some people see what Trump's doing as a real chance for peace, a way to finally stop the fighting and start rebuilding their lives. But others are nervous. They've seen how much damage this conflict has caused, so they're not sure about making concessions to Russia.
Yeah, I bet there's a lot of mistrust, a fear that any deal might not really keep them safe.
Exactly. And we have to acknowledge those fears and make sure that their voices are heard and their concerns are addressed throughout the process.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for sure. But one thing seems clear. Trump really wants to do something about this conflict, and he doesn't care about shaking things up to get it done.
He's definitely not afraid to try new things.
Yeah.
But we don't know yet if it's going to work out. The stakes are so high, and what happens could affect a lot of people, not just in the U.S. and Russia, but in the whole region.
It shows you that diplomacy is complicated. It's not always clear what's going to happen.
Absolutely. It's more like chess than checkers. Every move can change the whole game.
So what happens next in this diplomatic dance? What are the big things that need to happen first?
Well, the first big hurdle is Congress. Can Trump get enough support in Congress to get this sanctions relief plan approved? That's going to be a big test for him and a sign of whether this whole thing is actually going to work.
And if he does get Congress to go along with it, what happens then?
Then the real negotiations start. The U.S. and Russia have to actually sit down and figure out all the details. Like, what is each side willing to give up? What can they do to make sure this peace actually lasts? It's going to be a long process, and it's not going to be easy.
I mean, we can't forget about Ukraine either. They're not just watching this happen. They're a big part of this whole situation. How much say will they have in what happens to them?
That's a really good point. Any solution has to take their needs into account. They need to be a part of this process. Otherwise, any agreement probably won't last very long.
That's a lot to think about, right? All this geopolitics, economics, and what people want for their lives.
It really is. And it reminds you that we live in a world that's always changing. And trying to make peace is never simple.
It's wild how everything's connected, isn't it? We started talking about maybe easing sanctions, and now we're talking about what happens to power in the world.
Yeah, it really is all connected. That just shows you how complicated international relations are. Every little thing you do can cause a ripple effect, and it's hard to know what's going to happen.
It really makes you think about how important these decisions are, right? I mean, we're talking about peace or war, people doing well or really struggling, and how countries work together and who has the most power in the world.
Absolutely. And it reminds you that we're not just watching all of this happen. We can all do things to make the world better, like staying informed and talking about these things and supporting policies that we think are right.
So this isn't really just about the U.S. and Russia. It's about how everything in the world is tied together and how we can each do things to change things.
Exactly. It's about being a citizen of the world and knowing that what leaders do in Washington, Moscow, Kyiv, everywhere really does affect all of us.
That's a great point. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing you want our listener to think about?
That's a good question. I think it's important to remember that there's always more than one side to every story. And it's easy to get caught up in the news and what everyone's saying, but it's really important to take a step back and think about all the different parts, all the different reasons why things are happening and what might happen because of the choices people make.
Yeah, don't just take things at face value. You really got to dig deeper and question things and look for different points of view to really understand what's going on.
Exactly. Because if we really want a more peaceful and fair world, we have to understand things and think about them carefully.
Well said. Okay, well, I think that about wraps up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave our listener with one last thought to chew on.
Okay, go for it.
So we've talked about how easing sanctions on Russia could be good for the economy and maybe help end the conflict in Ukraine. But like we said, there are also risks, things that could go wrong if we do that.
Right. We have to really think about the risks and the rewards.
Okay, so here's a question for our listener out there. If you were President Trump, what would be the most important things you would think about when making this decision? What would be your main goals?
Would you focus on the economy? Or on getting peace? Or on standing up to Russia? Or maybe all of those things?
It's a tough call. There's no easy answer. But whatever happens, it's going to have a huge impact on the world.
Yeah, this reminds us that even though we can talk to anyone in the world instantly and everything's so connected, diplomacy is still a really difficult thing.
And it's something that affects all of us. So stay informed and keep asking tough questions. Because if we really want a better world, we have to talk about these things and be informed about them so we can do something about it.
Very well said. It's been great talking about this really complicated and ever-changing issue with you.
I agree. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today.
We hope you learned something from this deep dive and that it made you want to keep learning about these really important topics.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.